When we think about Southeast Asia in terms of religion, it's very diverse. And so linguistically, very diverse. In terms of its physical geography, very diverse, but also in terms of religion. So we think about the reasons why. Quite obviously, we have those outside influences that have left their imprint, those different layers I just mentioned in the text, interacting with the various local and ethnic groups or the indigenous groups who already in themselves were quite diverse and quite varied from one island to the next. So very important to think about this particular region, very religiously diverse. Also, why do I talk about religion? Why do I emphasize this? We see conflicts across the world. We see tensions between different groups, different cultural groups, different ethnic groups, maybe different religions. Sometimes those local conflicts, what do you know? They bring in regional countries into that conflict. And so you have neighboring countries that get brought into it. And then what do you know? We have outside influences, international, across different continents now getting pulled into it. We see this in Syria. So, I want to emphasize we have these different parts where we have the recipe or we have the potential for some conflict. So, when it happens, you're definitely already prepared for it. You know and expect it's going to happen there. So if we're going to talk about a religiously diverse region, let's start off with Singapore. Why? Because it was just ranked in 2014 by Pew Research, a very reputable research operation, that it was the world's most religiously diverse country in the world. So Singapore, very cosmopolitan, in terms of Americans, of all the places in Asia, where if you would go there, it would seem kind of most like the United States, most like, what we think of, developed countries, Singapore would be it. And so in Singapore, it's 34% Buddhist, 18% Christian, 16% unaffiliated, secular, non-believers, what have you, 14% Muslim, 10% other, whatever that might be, 5% Hindu, and 10% folk religions, and just less than 1% Jewish. So very diverse. Next up is Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country based on number of adherents. And so normally people think it's a Middle Eastern country or Northern Africa, but actually Indonesia, there's more Muslims in Indonesia, in this particular country, than any other in the world. And so the Muslim faith arrived here somewhere in the 1200s, but then became hardcore in the 1500s and 1600s in terms of being the dominant religion of Indonesia or this particular area. But what's going on here is you definitely have more than just the Muslim faith. And so, yeah, it is the majority. It is definitely a Muslim country. But when you think about those islands, especially the smaller islands, ones that are a little bit more remote, a little bit more isolated, they're going to find more of an animist or the indigenous religions. But just essentially the Muslim faith, it varies in terms of its intensity from one island to the next. It just depends on where you're at. So we think about the Muslim faith, it is very hardcore here in Indonesia. So some exceptions to that, you see a very small little purple island there in the southern part of the Java Sea, just to the east of the island of Java, and that is the island of Bali, B-A-L-I, in which Hindu is the most common religion there. But it's very diverse. You also find a good amount of Christians. Bali is very much a tourist destination for young people, particularly Europeans and Australians. So a lot of cool architecture. It's a cool, hip place to go to. Other things you'd find throughout Indonesia, although we don't see any red on here indicating Buddhists. Those overseas Chinese I've mentioned, who are Buddhists, they particularly there in urban areas you find them, and so the Buddhists, and we associate them with the overseas Chinese. Also, if we look to the eastern part of Indonesia, you start to see a little bit more blue. You see there the island of New Guinea, the western half. So there you'll find Protestant. Also on the island of Sulawesi, which is on the southern part of the Celebes Sea, just south of Philippines. You'll also see some blue there, and that's Christianity. So those are also Protestants. And on that island of Sulawesi, you do see a conflict between Muslims and Christians on this particular island. And once again, sometimes these can pull in other countries and can be a destination for different groups and different conflicts to engage in terrorist behavior or whatever we would find in any type of conflicted area. So that's something to watch out for. Also on the island of Borneo, in the western half, you can see it's a very light green. Well, that particular area is where the indigenous population of the island of Borneo, that's where we find them in large numbers. And so it is some Muslims. So it's kind of a mix of Muslims and indigenous, which creates that kind of that very pale light green color. So we see Indonesia very diverse. Next up is Malaysia. Malaysia is 60% Muslim, and it's also the official religion of the country. However, we see it's colored green here in both Borneo and the peninsula, but there's more going on there. It's 20% Buddhist, it's 10% Christian, 5% Hindu, and then in rural, more remote areas, you're going to find a little bit more of those traditional folk religions, animist religions, indigenous religions, what have you. Next up is Brunei, in which it is the state religion. So Brunei really is a lot like a Persian Gulf country we talked about before in UAE, Qatar, which is very wealthy. It's also very Muslim. And so here, it's, 2/3 Muslim, but it's run by the Sultan of Brunei, who's one of the wealthiest people in the world. They're wealthiest because they're the prime minister, they're head of the economy, obviously, but they're also the religious leader as well. So they're kind of have the multiple thrones there as the Sultan of Brunei in the Sultanate of Brunei. One of the things you'll find here, also similar to the Middle East and Persian Gulf, is very strict adherence to the Muslim faith. And so here, alcohol, very hard to find. So you can't get your booze in Brunei. The Philippines, you think about how far it is from the Roman Catholicism cultural hearth in the Mediterranean, about as far as you can go. But nonetheless, the Philippines is a majority Roman Catholic Christian country. And so it's not Protestant, it's Catholic, unlike the ones I just talked about beforehand in Indonesia. Why is that? It's from the Spanish era. So the Spanish left their legacy. Spanish, if you go back up to Spain, you're going to find there it's a largely a Roman Catholic country. They're in the Mediterranean, so same thing. We're going to expect to find here when they colonized and left their imprint. But if you look in the Philippines towards the southern part, you do see a little bit of a lighter blue, but also a little bit of green. So when you go to the southern part of the Philippines, you're going to find more Muslims. So one of the things you'll also note in this particular area is the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in this particular area. And so expect to see some tensions here, and maybe some, in groups that want to become their own country and claim an island and say we should be our own country, especially since the southern part of the country is a little bit farther away from the core of the country there in Manila. Similar to Indonesia, of course, remote islands, small islands, isolated islands, you're going to get more of the indigenous religions, more isolated, so thus your more folk cultures are going to be remaining intact. Also, in part, you're going to find overseas Chinese, and once again, overseas Chinese, we're going to associate with Buddhism, but also some Confucianism and some other Chinese religions, Taoism, which I'll talk about later. The other Roman Catholic country in Southeast Asia is East Timor. And that's because it was a former Portuguese colony. Portugal is a country in Europe in which it's Roman Catholic. So once again, very similar to Spain. It's right next to Spain. You can also see why here Roman Catholicism is the most common religion. East Timor is a relatively new country. It came to be here in the 21st century. As we go west to east across mainland Southeast Asia, we begin with Burma, and as you can see here colored red, that's indicated on the left-hand side as being a Buddhist country. So it is mostly Buddhist. There are some exceptions. One exception would be a particular state or particular area within Burma called the Chin State, C-H-I-N, in which you find, or did find, a good amount of Christians. However, those Christians were persecuted. Essentially, they were, ethnically cleansed by the majority group, in which they tried to wipe them out, and so they became Christian refugees. So the United States, in which we have a lot of Christians, which are very much compassionate to Christian refugees, we've since accepted a lot of them from the Chin State. Where do we find them? Southport. So on the south side of Indianapolis, you see a large Burmese population, and those are Burmese Christians who are essentially being persecuted by the majority group because they are the minority group, they're Christians. To the east of Burma is Thailand, which is also colored red, thus indicating a Buddhist country. And it is sort of a state religion there in Thailand, kind of sort of government sponsored. But we do find other religions, of course. And as you get closer to Malaysia, you do find more of a Muslim population. So once again, you're going to expect to see some tensions here between the majority Buddhist group to the north and the increasingly majority group there in the southern part of Thailand that is Muslim. To the east of Thailand and Burma is Laos. And so you see that it's the country that has a little bit more purple in it than the other ones in that particular area. And so to the east we see a large purple, and that's, we see just across the border is China. So you see some traditional folk religions, especially Chinese folk religions, and it makes sense because it borders along there. So once again, the Chinese have historically had a large influence in the particular area. But you also find a good amount of Buddhists here as well. Next up in Cambodia, very similar to Laos, in which it has a large Buddhist population. A little bit more here in Cambodia than Laos. But it also has a good amount of those traditional folk religions as indigenous groups or as an animist, whatever we lump those all in together as. And finally, Vietnam. And as it's indicated here, it shows it being a Buddhist country, which, yeah, it does have a lot of Buddhists. But what it actually has more of is what we call Vietnamese folk religion. So it's a traditional religion that definitely has influences from the Chinese, which is, of course, just right there, right across the border. So once again, the role of the Chinese in this particular area has been for a long, long time, and will still continue to be that for a long, long time. But this is kind of a blend of Taoism, Confucianism, and traditional Chinese religions, but it's a distinctive Vietnamese folk religion here.